4 years into a conflict that has reshaped lives across continents, another development has emerged, this time involving South Africa. South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has publicly thanked Russian President Vladimir Putin for helping secure the return of 17 South Africans, 17 men who, according to the South African government, were allegedly tricked into joining the Russia-Ukraine war. It is a number that carries weight. And behind that number are individuals who believed they were traveling for something very different. Last November, the South African government said it had received distress calls from members of this group, calls that signaled something had gone wrong. The men believed they were going to Russia for bodyguard training. Instead, they found themselves on the front line of the war in Ukraine. The difference between expectation and reality could not have been more stark. Training for protection versus exposure to combat. It is a shift that changes everything, and it prompted action at the highest level. President Cyril Ramaphosa thanked Vladimir Putin for assistance in securing their return. That acknowledgement is official. It is on record. The South African presidency confirmed that 4 of the men had already returned. They arrived last Friday. 11 others, according to the president's office, would be on their way home soon, and 2 more would return at a later stage. 17 in total. 4 home, 11 expected, 2 later. The arithmetic is clear. But the path that led to this moment is anything but simple. Last November, when those distress calls were received, the government publicly acknowledged them. The calls came from men who had joined mercenary forces in the conflict. They had believed they were signing up for bodyguard training in Russia. Instead, they were on the front line. The phrase front line carries gravity. It is not a training ground, it is not a classroom, it is not a rehearsal, it is active conflict, and the South African government says those men had been allegedly tricked into joining the war. Allegedly tricked. That is the wording used. An investigation into their recruitment is ongoing, which means questions remain. How were they recruited? Who approached them? What promises were made? Those details are still under investigation, but what is confirmed is this. Distress calls were received. 17 men were involved. 4 have returned. 11 are expected soon, 2 later. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin for assistance. And the government has stated that the recruitment investigation continues. When governments acknowledge distress calls, it signals urgency. When presidents thank foreign leaders for assistance, it signals diplomacy. And when men return home after being on the front line of a war they did not expect to fight, it signals something deeper. A reminder of how quickly circumstances can shift. The men believed they were traveling for bodyguard training. Bodyguard training suggests structure, instruction, preparation. Instead, they were positioned in an active war zone. The contrast is stark, and that contrast defines this development. 17 South Africans allegedly tricked. 4 already home, 11 soon, 2 later. An investigation underway, and a public thank you from one head of state to another. 17 men came home, one might say softly, and that matters. No embellishment is needed. The facts stand on their own. The South African government received distress calls last November. The men had joined mercenary forces in the conflict. They believed they were going for training. They ended up on the front line in Ukraine. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin. 4 returned last Friday. 11 will be on their way soon, 2 later. An investigation continues. This is where we begin, with confirmed returns, with official acknowledgments, with diplomatic gratitude expressed publicly, and with a recruitment investigation still unfolding. The details are measured, the language precise, the sequence documented. Last November, distress calls, 17 men involved, allegedly tricked into joining the Russia-Ukraine war, believed they were heading for bodyguard training. Instead, on the front line, 4 have returned. 11 will follow. 2 later, investigation ongoing. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin. These are the facts as stated. And in a conflict that spans continents, this moment draws South Africa directly into the frame. 17 citizens, an alleged deception, a return home, and an investigation that continues. Sometimes the simplest sentences carry the heaviest weight. They thought they were going to train. That is the starting point. And from there, everything changed. We will look more closely at how this unfolded, at the timeline, at the confirmation from the president's office, and at what it means for those still on their way home. But first, the essentials are clear. 17 men, Distress calls last November, allegedly tricked. Frontline in Ukraine, 4 returned last Friday, 11 soon, 2 later. Investigation ongoing. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin. This is where the record stands tonight, and this is where we continue last November. That is when the South African government says it received distress calls from the group of men. Distress calls, not routine check-ins, not travel updates. Distress calls. 17 South Africans had joined mercenary forces connected to the Russia-Ukraine war. They believed they were going to Russia for bodyguard training. That belief is central. It shapes everything that followed. Bodyguard training suggests preparation for protective work. It suggests controlled instruction. It suggests a structured environment. Instead, according to the South African government, these men ended up on the front line of the war in Ukraine. Front line, a phrase that changes the entire equation, from anticipated training to active conflict, from expectation to reality. And that shift triggered those calls for help. The South African government acknowledged those calls publicly last November. It confirmed that the men had joined mercenary forces. It confirmed that they believed they were going to Russia for bodyguard training. And it confirmed that they had ended up in Ukraine on the front line of the war. That is the sequence as stated: belief, departure, deployment, distress. From there, diplomatic channels moved. President Cyril Ramaphosa later thanked Russian President Vladimir Putin for helping to secure the return of the 17 South Africans. The gratitude was direct. It was official. It was issued from the president's office. Ramaphosa's office confirmed specific numbers. 4 of the men returned last Friday. 11 others would be on their way home soon. 2 more at a later stage. 17 in total. 4 already home. 11 soon. 2 later. The structure of the return is incremental, not all at once, but progressing. And alongside that progress, the South African government stated that an investigation into their recruitment was ongoing. Ongoing. That means the matter is not closed. The question of how these men were recruited remains under examination. They allegedly were tricked into joining the war. Allegedly tricked. That is the phrasing used. The allegation centers on deception. The men believed they were heading to Russia for bodyguard training. Instead, they were placed on the front line of an international conflict. The distinction is not subtle. Training implies preparation. The front line implies immediate exposure to combat. And so the distress calls last November become a pivotal moment because they signaled a disconnect between promise and reality. When those calls were received, the South African government publicly acknowledged them. That acknowledgement made the situation official. It moved the matter from private confusion to public concern. And now, months later, the return of the men is unfolding in stages. 4 returned last Friday. That date is confirmed. 11 more are expected soon. 2 later. It is a process still underway. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin for assistance in securing their return. The gratitude suggests cooperation at a state level, diplomatic engagement, communication between governments. No further interpretation is added beyond what has been stated. The facts remain steady. 17 South Africans joined mercenary forces in the conflict, believed they were going for bodyguard training in Russia, ended up on the front line of the war in Ukraine. Distress calls last November. 4 returned last Friday, 11 on their way soon, 2 later. Investigation ongoing, and the language used throughout is careful. Allegedly tricked. Distress calls on their way home soon. Investigation ongoing. Each phrase carries legal and diplomatic weight. Each phrase reflects official communication. It is also notable that the men were part of mercenary forces in the conflict. That detail situates their involvement within a specific structure, not enlisted through formal national military channels, but through mercenary forces. And it is within that framework that the alleged deception occurred. They believed they were traveling for training. Instead, they were positioned in an active war zone. That shift is the core of the issue. The South African government's response includes both diplomatic outreach and domestic investigation. Diplomatic outreach resulted in confirmed returns. Domestic investigation continues to examine recruitment. That dual track is clear, one focused on return, the other on accountability. As of now, 4 men are back in South Africa. 11 are expected soon, 2 later, 17 total. And the president's office has confirmed these numbers. Sometimes the starkness of a fact requires no embellishment. They thought they were going to train, one might say quietly. Instead, they found a battlefield. There is no need to add to that. The timeline speaks plainly. Last November, distress calls after joining mercenary forces, after believing they were traveling for bodyguard training, instead positioned on the front line in Ukraine. Months later, returns begin. 4 home, 11 soon, 2 later, investigation ongoing. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin. The international dimension remains visible. This is a South African issue involving a war in Ukraine and diplomatic coordination with Russia. 3 countries connected by one development, South Africa, Russia, Ukraine, but at the center of it all are 17 individuals. And as of now, the process of bringing them home continues. 4 already home, 11 soon, 2 later. That cadence repeats because it matters, because each number represents movement, and because the investigation into how they were recruited remains open, which means more details may emerge through official channels. But tonight, the confirmed information is steady. Distress calls were received last November. The men had joined mercenary forces. They believed they were going for bodyguard training. Instead, they ended up on the front line of the war in Ukraine. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin for helping secure their return. 4 have returned. 11 are on their way soon. 2 later. Investigation ongoing. And as this process continues, the facts remain fixed. 17 men allegedly tricked. Frontline distress calls, returns in stages, investigation ongoing, diplomatic acknowledgement issued. It is a sequence that connects promise and consequence. And it is a sequence that is still unfolding. We now turn to what this means in the broader context of ongoing investigations and official responses. Because while the returns are underway, the questions surrounding recruitment remain active. And that is where this moves next. 4 men are home. 11 are expected soon, 2 more at a later stage, 17 in total. That is where the situation stands, according to the office of South Africa's President, Cyril Ramaphosa. The confirmation is specific. 4 returned last Friday. 11 would be on their way home soon, 2 later. And while that return process unfolds, another process continues quietly alongside it. An investigation into their recruitment. Ongoing, that is the word used, ongoing. The South African government has said the men were allegedly tricked into joining the Russia-Ukraine war. Allegedly tricked. The allegation centers on deception. The men believed they were going to Russia for bodyguard training. Instead, they ended up on the front line of the war in Ukraine. That difference remains at the heart of the investigation. The belief that they were traveling for training, the reality that they were placed in active conflict. The South African government received distress calls from the group last November, distress calls that alerted authorities to what had happened. That moment marked a turning point. It moved the situation into official hands. From that point forward, diplomatic and investigative steps began to take shape. President Ramaphosa later thanked Russian President Vladimir Putin for helping secure the return of the 17 South Africans. The gratitude was formal. It was publicly acknowledged. It underscored the diplomatic dimension of this development. But diplomacy alone does not close the matter, because even as men return home, questions remain. How were they recruited? Who presented the opportunity? What representations were made about bodyguard training? Those are not answered yet. They are under investigation. And so the situation now exists in 2 tracks. The first is visible. 4 men home, 11 soon, 2 later. The second is procedural, an investigation ongoing into the recruitment that allegedly led them to join mercenary forces and ultimately end up on the front line in Ukraine. The South African government has not indicated that the investigation is complete. It has stated only that it continues, that wording matters. It suggests that authorities are examining the circumstances that led to the men's departure. It suggests a review of recruitment practices. It suggests accountability is being explored. At the same time, the diplomatic acknowledgement stands on record. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin for assistance. That assistance resulted in confirmed returns. 17 South Africans allegedly tricked into joining the war. 4 returned last Friday, 11 on their way soon, 2 later. The numbers remain consistent, the language remains measured. The men believed they were going to Russia for bodyguard training. Instead, they found themselves on the front line of the war in Ukraine. It is a statement that requires no embellishment, a training expectation replaced by combat exposure. That contrast alone explains the distress calls last November. Those calls triggered government action, and months later that action is yielding returns. 4 home, 11 soon, 2 later. The investigation into recruitment continues. And as it continues, the broader context remains unchanged. The Russia-Ukraine war is ongoing. The front line remains active. And within that landscape, these 17 South Africans were placed, allegedly through deception. Now, the emphasis shifts to resolution. Resolution for the individuals returning, resolution through investigation, resolution through official process. But resolution is not yet complete. 4 have returned. 13 remain in stages of return. 11 soon, 2 later. That progression is documented. And until all 17 are home, the process remains in motion. Sometimes the most powerful sentence is the simplest one. They believed they were going to train. That is where it began. And from that belief flowed everything else: the distress calls, the diplomatic outreach, the investigation, the staged returns. 17 men who believed they were heading for bodyguard training in Russia, instead on the front line in Ukraine. Distress calls last November. President Ramaphosa thanked President Putin. 4 returned last Friday, 11 soon, 2 later, investigation ongoing. No speculation is added, no assumptions made. The facts remain as confirmed, and those facts are sufficient. 17 South Africans allegedly tricked into joining a war. 4 home, 11 on their way, 2 later, an investigation continuing. Diplomatic thanks expressed, and a process that, while progressing, is not yet finished. When all 17 are home, one part of this chapter will close, but the investigation will determine how it began. For now, the record is clear. Distress calls last November, alleged deception regarding bodyguard training, placement on the front line of the war in Ukraine, 4 returned, 11 soon, 2 later, investigation ongoing, and that is where this stands tonight.